There are probably 10 or 12 different features of the Civil Rights Act. But as I said previously, it boils down to primarily two areas: public accommodations, access for African Americans and indeed all people, and certain guarantees on the right to vote. This legislation, of course, would be held, and it, of course, would become something that we would still look at many years later. Today, President's Day, it's very appropriate to look at the presidents and then decide how much credit our various presidents have for the enactment and then the continuation of the Civil Rights Act. So if you look at Kennedy and Johnson, does one of them deserve more credit for the passing of the Civil Rights Act? As a history professor, I think it's very fascinating how we have viewed Kennedy over the years. President Kennedy, like President Lincoln, both tragically assassinated, led initially to scholars and even the public calling them champions of civil rights, both Kennedy and Lincoln in that regard. Over time, scholars would take a much more critical and even cynical view of Kennedy. They would eventually say, if you consider that he won the 1960 presidential race by a razor-thin margin, and it was the African-American vote that was the critical difference, then they criticized his reluctance to do much in the whole area of civil rights. Lyndon Johnson initially would receive a lot of credit as well. People would talk about his adroit political skills, how he was able to work both the House and the Senate to get things done. Interestingly, over time, some people would take a rather harsher look at Johnson, and they would say, well, he was just a skilled politician. My response to that, even if that were true, does it lessen his accomplishment of getting the civil rights legislation passed? I have to admit, when I was the age of many of you students, I was very critical of both Johnson and Kennedy. I tended not to give them perhaps all of the credit that they deserved. Over time, however, as I've come to understand even more that the art of American politics calls for politicians, no matter what the issue is, to be able to find often the viable middle ground, it means they have to find a way to compromise. That no matter what the issue is, no matter how important they think the issue is, there's probably someone on the other side. Complicating things for both Kennedy and Johnson was the solid anti-black vote in the South. And both of them knew that that would be very difficult. In fact, Johnson, when finally passing the Civil Rights Act, predicted that the South would switch from being Democrat to Republican, that he essentially said what is the case today. Well, over the last 50 years, of course, we've had, you students can probably say it better than me, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama as presidents. How do we evaluate them when it comes to civil rights? Okay. I think all of us need to be careful that we probably have blinders on when it comes to evaluating our presidents on issues that mean a lot to us. I noticed that consistently, personally, I tended to be very critical of what I called liberal presidents because I view my politics as liberal, although most people don't view my politics as liberal. I thought my politics were liberal, and I tended to be harsher and more critical of the Democratic presidents because I expected more from them when it came to civil rights than I had for the Republican presidents. But as I thought more about it, I wonder if I've been fair to both groups. Have I been too harsh on not giving the Democrats enough credit? Have I been too lenient on the Republicans for not, when they didn't do more in the area of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? But when I think about them collectively, when I look at all the presidents, beginning with Nixon, now to Obama, I have decided that overall I am disappointed with all of those presidents when it comes to looking at the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and what has happened since then. And my disappointment is that, at least in my view, they have not made having a dialogue about the issues that the Civil Rights Act touched upon a real priority or part of their agenda. I live in America today where we don't discuss race and race relations and all of the offshoots of that the way we did in the 1960s. It's almost as if we are afraid, or it's almost as if we don't listen to each other, that we often go into sound bites, or we're too quick to label people who have a different perspective than we do in a negative way, thereby shutting off the conversation. So I am disappointed. My disappointment is also heightened by some of the scholarship that I have done since the 1990s. Beginning in the 1990s, as the gentleman said here, my scholarship has been concentrated on the American South, primarily on the border state of Kentucky, where I grew up in. I decided that the comments that I made about race in Kentucky concerned me. That in Kentucky, where black people, in the time period that I was writing about, were clearly the victims of some horrendous racial acts, I was afraid that somebody could read my 3 books and they would come away with the view that white people are villains and black people are victims. It's much more complicated than that. But I wanted to understand race relations in a larger context, and most definitely this applied to the Civil Rights Act. So I decided that I would start traveling abroad to look at race relations in a number of perspectives. So for me, beginning actually in the late 80s, I started first going to England, France, Germany, Amsterdam, those type of places, and seeing race relations. Interestingly, in Amsterdam, a place that is considered liberal, I noticed they had all of these people of color who were there from Suriname in South America, and on the surface it seemed like race relations were pretty good. People were pretty tolerant in Amsterdam, but if you were a person from Suriname, you were treated disrespectfully. On one occasion, my wife and I went into a small jewelry store. Had no intention to buy a Rolex, we were just looking around. And there was one clerk in the store, and that clerk was on the telephone. And that person remained on the phone till at a certain point, my wife and I realized something's not right here. And the person kept talking, and I said, what the heck? Really, I said, what the hell? But I'm not at Prairie View. I said, what the heck here? Okay, so I then said, let's just get out of here. We walked to the door, and the person had electronically locked us in there. And that person continued talking on the phone. And finally, when she got off the phone, she said, what are you doing in here? What do you people want? And then I said, I just want to leave. And she could hear my rural African-American Kentucky accent, and she realized I was not from Suriname. I could tell you about some of the problems we encountered in Germany, a place that I dearly love. I've been to Germany, 15 times and so forth, but there have been some instances where they thought I was from one of the African countries, not the United States, and I was treated differently. But the 2 places that mean the most to me in the context of my saying I'm disappointed with what the United States has done has been my travels to Australia and to South Africa. On 3 different occasions, I've traveled doing research in Australia, trying to understand what happened to the Aborigine people there. In February, February the 8th, 2008, the new Prime Minister, Devin Rudd, of Australia issued an apology to the Australian people. In it, he said, we cannot go forward as a nation without first looking back and address the injustices that we did in this country. And he talked about the forgotten generations in Australia, the stolen generations of where these people from 1909 to 1969, their children were systematically taken away from them and put in orphanages. Australia said an Aborigine child was better off being in an orphanage than in the home with their parents. Well, the Prime Minister said, we apologize and we must go forward. I, as an American scholar, has wondered, when is the United States going to look at slavery and then the quasi-slavery up until 1964. By the way, students, if you were in my class, Bill and Emily can tell you that. Anytime I say quasi, I always then say it's like a woman being quasi-pregnant.